The family is taking a photograph. The youngest is laughing because someone is making faces behind the camera. The oldest stands a little straighter, and somewhere between them, another child waits. Not crying, not demanding, just waiting for someone to notice where to stand. The camera flashes. Years later, almost everyone remembers where the oldest was standing. They remember what the youngest was wearing. The child in the middle is harder to recall. Most people believe that is where the story begins, the forgotten child. But that isn't what psychologists became interested in. A more unsettling question was this: what happens when growing up means learning that attention is not something you receive, but something you negotiate? Not because your parents loved you less, not because your siblings wanted to erase you, but because every family is a living system, constantly redistributing time, energy, expectation, and affection among people who are all competing for the same invisible resource, attention. And no position inside that system is more paradoxical than the one in the middle. Because being overlooked is rarely loud. It is almost always quiet. Families rarely notice when they create different worlds for each child. They believe they are raising brothers and sisters inside the same home, the same walls, the same dinner table, the same parents. But psychology has spent decades arriving at an uncomfortable conclusion. There is no such thing as the same childhood. The firstborn enters a family of two adults, suddenly learning how to become parents. Every milestone is celebrated because everything is happening for the first time. The youngest often arrives years later into a household that already understands itself. Rules have softened. Expectations have shifted. Experience has replaced uncertainty. The middle child arrives somewhere between those two stories, not first enough to redefine the family, not last enough to symbolize its completion, existing inside a role that has no obvious script, and that absence may become the script itself. For more than a century, psychologists have tried to understand whether birth order quietly shapes personality. It began with an Austrian physician named Alfred Adler, who noticed something curious while observing families. Children were not simply responding to their parents, they were responding to each other. Every sibling inherited more than genes. They inherited a position, and positions create strategies. The oldest often learns responsibility because responsibility already exists. The youngest can discover charm because older siblings have already explored authority. But the middle child occupies a far stranger landscape, the space between imitation and expectation. Too old to be protected, too young to lead, forced to discover another way of becoming visible. Adler believed that families function almost like miniature ecosystems, where each child unconsciously adapts to occupy a unique niche. The theory was elegant, perhaps too elegant, because decades later, scientists would discover something unexpected. The evidence refused to tell a simple story. Researchers searched for the personality of the middle child, again and again, across countries, across generations, across thousands of families. Sometimes they found patterns. Sometimes those patterns disappeared entirely. Large studies often reported that birth order explains surprisingly little about intelligence or broad personality traits once genetics, family size, and socioeconomic factors are carefully controlled. Yet something remained impossible to ignore. Millions of people who grew up as middle children described experiences that felt uncannily similar, feeling overlooked, feeling independent earlier than expected, becoming the peacemaker, avoiding conflict, watching carefully before speaking. If the personality wasn't universal, why did the experience feel so familiar? That mystery forced psychologists to stop asking the wrong question. Perhaps birth order doesn't determine who you become. Perhaps it changes the problems you spend your childhood trying to solve. And problems have a remarkable way of shaping people. Human beings are born astonishingly dependent. Long before language, the infant brain is already asking one relentless question. How do I keep the people who protect me close? The question is never spoken. It doesn't need words. It becomes patterns of attention, patterns of comfort, patterns of expectation. Over thousands of small moments, children learn which behaviors bring connection and which disappear into silence. Some discover that achievement earns praise. Others discover that vulnerability brings comfort. Others learn that making everyone laugh can dissolve tension before it becomes conflict. These are not conscious decisions. They are adaptations, tiny evolutionary negotiations unfolding inside kitchens, bedrooms, and back seats of family cars. And the middle child often grows up in an environment where the easiest way to survive is not to demand attention, but to anticipate everyone else's. This may explain why researchers have repeatedly noticed something intriguing. Many middle children report feeling unusually skilled at reading social dynamics, not because they were born diplomats, because diplomacy became useful. When two siblings naturally occupy the roles of pioneer and favorite baby, the child between them often becomes something less obvious. The translator, the observer, the negotiator. Not every middle child, not every family, but often enough that therapists recognize the pattern before the person describing it does. The irony is difficult to ignore. The child who feels unseen may become exceptionally gifted at seeing everyone else. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the greatest illusion surrounding middle children is the belief that they were forgotten at all. Memory is selective. Families remember milestones. First steps, first graduations, the youngest last moments of childhood. The middle years often contain fewer dramatic firsts or lasts. Psychology calls this the serial position effect. Beginnings and endings naturally stand out more in memory than what lies between. The middle can seem invisible not because it lacked meaning, but because the human mind is drawn to edges. What feels like neglect may sometimes be the architecture of memory itself. And yet, a child cannot distinguish between intentional neglect and ordinary human attention. To the developing brain, what matters is not why attention was missing, only that it was. Perhaps that is why the idea of the forgotten sibling has survived for generations. Not because it is universally true, but because it gives language to a feeling that many people struggled to name. A quiet sense of existing just outside the spotlight, of becoming adaptable before becoming understood, of learning to observe before learning to ask. The middle child may never have been forgotten by history, or by psychology, or even by their family, but somewhere during childhood, many learned a lesson that reaches far beyond birth order. That identity is often built not only from the attention we receive, but from the attention we spend our lives trying to earn. And perhaps that is the strange architecture of every family. No two children inherit the same home, even when they share the same address. Because houses are built from walls, families are built from relationships, and relationships are always changing. Which means the child standing quietly between everyone else may never have been standing in the middle at all, only at the place where we first begin asking the oldest psychological question of all: who am I when no one is looking?